Pete Singer has a PhD in government from Harvard University, has a bachelor's degree from Princeton University, has advised Congress, has advised the Central Intelligence Agency, has advised the Department of Defense, has advised the White House on a number of issues. He's written New York Times best-selling books. He's written books on subjects from military contractors to child soldiers to the book we've asked him to come talk about today on the robotics industry and its initial growth in the defense side of the world, if you will, called Wired for War. He's been spending some time meeting with some key leaders from our region in last night and this morning and having some really great conversations. He answered a question for us last night about why robots a couple years ago. And then this morning he talked about really what are the opportunities outside the defense market. And I think those were all the feedback I've gotten is that it's been fantastic having her. So I want to say thank you for sharing your expertise, first off. And then I hope you will all give him a very warm welcome all the way from the Brookings Institution in Washington, D.C. to Minneapolis, Minnesota. Thanks for joining us, Pete.
Great. Well, thank you for that really kind welcome. And also want to thank the sponsors for helping to put this all together. About a year and a half ago, the leaders of the Robotics Trade Group, the Association for Unmanned Vehicles and Systems International, gathered for a strategic retreat. And the group was gathering a lot like for a meeting like this, as much to interact with your peers as get a sense of what's going on with the latest of technology, but in particular they were engaged in a form of institutional soul searching. That is, the group had come an incredibly long way in a short amount of time. This trade group had been formed in 1972 in Dayton, Ohio by a couple of defense contractors and Air Force officers who are enamored of the idea of planes without human pilots physically inside of them. They were just a couple folks actually held their first meeting in a conference room at a Holiday Inn. Now, since 1972, the organization has boomed. To give you a sense of its scale right now, it's grown to over 1,500 member companies, not just members, but member companies, with chapters in 55 different countries. Its conferences aren't held at the Holiday Inn anymore. Its conferences are actually held, they alternate between the Washington, D.C. Convention Center, where they fill the entire convention center, and Denver, where they actually hold it in the football stadium where Tim Tebow plays at. So it gives you a sense of the scale of what's going on. But it was because of this that they were pulling back and trying to figure out what's happening here. At this crucial point in the organization's history, they were trying to figure out what is the story of robotics. That is, what is the story they should be telling their own members about what they do, but also what's the story they should be telling the rest of the world about what they do. This question of narrative, of story, was taken so seriously that the moderator for the conference wasn't a leading roboticist, wasn't a CEO of a leading robotics company. They actually hired a professional storyteller to come in and guide them. As one of them put it, what we have to figure out is, where have we come from, where are we now, and where should we, and where do we want to go next? And I think this question of story is a fascinating one, not just for them as an organization, but for all of us in trying to figure out what is the story of robotics. And so what I'd like to try and do today is walk through what I think are some of the most important parts of the story of robotics, particularly as it applies to war, but also beyond. Now, I am from Washington, D.C. I do a lot of work with the military. There's a lot of folks in here that work with the military, and we get very itchy if we don't have a PowerPoint going. So what I'm going to do is actually have, hopefully if the technology works with us, have a PowerPoint going, but it's going to be a different kind. One, if just hopefully it'll work, but two, it's just going to be a series of pictures and images of robotics out there in the war, in the real world today. It's to give you the visual side of the story. Also, just between you and me, it's to force you to look up while I'm talking rather than checking your email. If you want to get that part of the story, you have to look up. It gives you something else to look at if you get tired of me. Finally, it's to make the folks from Recon really happy because it actually has a couple pictures of their competitors' robots being blown up by IEDs. So hopefully the technology will work for us here. All right. So the book that I did, Wired for War, is about how there is something going on in the history of technology, the history of war, but maybe even the history of humanity right now. The U.S. military force that went into Iraq in 2003 had a handful of unmanned aerial systems supporting it. Drones, remotely piloted vehicles, whatever you want to call those systems, we had a handful in 2003. We now have more than 12,000 in the U.S. military inventory. On the ground, the invasion force had 0 unmanned ground vehicles. Like what should be flashing before you, we've got another, Skynet is not working with us today. Let's see if this works for us. All right, it should flip in a second. If it doesn't, I'll keep going. So on the ground, the invasion force had 0 unmanned ground vehicles. We now have more than 12,000 in the U.S. military inventory. Last year, the U.S. Air Force trained more unmanned systems operators than it trained manned bomber plane and manned fighter plane pilots combined. Many of those now serving out in North Dakota. Now we need to remember when we're talking about these systems, we're talking about the first generation actually. We're talking about the equivalent of the Model T Ford. We're talking about the equivalent of the Wright Brothers Flyer. Now, okay, but this is where we are right now. I think it's important to pull back and think about where we're headed next. I remember talking with a U.S. Air Force 3-star general who said, look, a lot of people are astounded by the fact that we have thousands of robotic systems in our wars today. But actually, the next conflict will have, quote, tens of thousands. Indeed, if you look at the U.S. aerospace industry right now, there's not a single defense contractor that has a manned combat aircraft under research and development right now. It's all unmanned in the R&D stages. Okay, hopefully that'll... all right, hopefully, fingers crossed, future robot overlords, be nice to us here. Okay, a lot of you are familiar with the concept of Moore's Law, the idea that we've been able to put more and more computing power into our microchips, into our computers, into our robotic systems, such that they basically double in their power and capacity just about every 18 months. Now, the idea of Moore's Law, though, I think is best encapsulated by the Hallmark greeting card. If you've ever held one of those Hallmark greeting cards that opens up and plays a little song, that's the best illustration I can give to you of technology's impact on war. Because just one of those cards that plays a little song has more computing power than the entire U.S. Army that my father served in. That's Moore's Law in action, that doubling effect year after year after year. Now the real important thing is what happens next. Within 25 years, if Moore's Law holds true, the way it has held true over the last 40 years, our technologies, our microchips, our computers, although we wouldn't know it today, will be 1 billion times more powerful than today. And I don't mean 1 billion in the way, folks like me in Washington talk about federal budgets, 1 billion here, 1 billion there, what's the big deal? I mean, literally, multiply their power with a 1 and 9 zeros behind it. Now, what if Moore's Law doesn't hold true? It's not a law of physics. It doesn't have to hold true. What if technology moves at a pace that's just 1/1000th as it has historically? That means our technology within 25 years, which is the period for which we're supposed to be doing strategic planning in the U.S. government, our technology will be just a mere 1,000,000 times more powerful than today. The point that I'm making here is the kind of things that we used to only talk about in science fiction conventions like Comic-Con are becoming something we're trying to figure out in places like the Pentagon. What is it like to live, work, and fight through a robotics revolution? Now, I need to be very, very clear. The robot revolution that I'm talking about is not the robo-apocalypse movie that Steven Spielberg is literally filming right now. It's not the concept that the former governor of California is going to show up at your door. It's not that kind of robot revolution. It's the idea that every so often a technology comes along and it changes the rules of a game. It's revolutionary. These technologies are very rare in history. There are technologies like the steam engine, gunpowder, the atomic bomb. And the key in these is they're revolutionary because they force us to answer questions. They force us to answer questions about what's possible that we didn't even imagine asking ourselves a generation earlier. But also, they force us to answer questions about what's proper, issues of right and wrong that we didn't have to wrestle with just a generation earlier. Now, it's interesting, when I run around the world of robotics and war, I was interviewing people and I was asking, what are the historic parallels for where we stand now with robotics? And the answers are fascinating. Most of the engineers would say, we're right now with robotics where the horseless carriage was just around 1910, 1911. And if you go back to that, think about horseless carriage, unmanned system. And only wrap our heads around what it's not rather than what it is, automobile, robot. But why is the horseless carriage important in history? Is it because I don't have a stable, I have a garage? No, it's the ripple effects beyond that. It's things like the mechanization of war, the mechanization of society. It's the impact on our cities. There's no such thing as suburbia before you have the horseless carriage. Its impacts on geopolitics and geoeconomics. There is a group of desert nomads at the time who turn out to be lucky enough to live over what was not considered a resource, but a nuisance, this black sticky liquid that would come up from the sand. Because of that, they move into a fairly dominant position in geoeconomics right now. It also drives global climate change, literally changing the planet itself. Changing social relationships. Before the horseless carriage, teenagers couldn't date. They were restricted to courting on their parents' front porch. New technologies, though, lead to new policy questions. We were talking about this at lunch today. New policy questions like, we need something new called traffic laws. The very first traffic laws for horseless carriages entailed that someone was supposed to walk in front of a horseless carriage with a flag to warn people that they were coming. And when they got to an intersection, they were supposed to fire a flare into the sky to let people know they were about to turn. This makes perfect sense from a policy perspective in a world that moves at 4 or 5 miles per hour. It doesn't make sense in a world that moves at 40 or 50 miles per hour. There's other parallels. Bill Gates, the founder of Microsoft, unsurprisingly makes a comparison to computers. But he says robotics right now are where computers were just around 1980. And think back to that. Big, bulky devices can do a limited set of functions. Military, the main spender on computers research and development. Military, the main buyer in the marketplace of computers. But very soon we learn more and more functions that they can do. And soon we get to the point that we stop calling them computers. So for example, I rode in Andrew's car with his 2 really cute kids that has over 100 computers in it. They were unsurprised by that. We don't call it a computerized car, but it is. Same thing, I heated up my tea this morning in a computer that's called a microwave oven. That is, these things are happening where computers are out there and we don't call them computers anymore. Same thing is happening with robotics. Ford, Mercedes, Volvo, Toyota, all came out with cars this year that have things like parking assist, crash avoidance technology, driver awareness technology. Basically, these are euphemisms for the fact that we stupid humans don't parallel park well, we often don't look in our blind spot, and we often fall asleep while we're driving, and so the robotic systems in the car are taking on those tasks for us. But again, why is the computer important? Is it because I don't have to memorize long division tables anymore? It's all of the ripple effects that come out of it. It's everything from allowing us to make billions of dollars in a nanosecond on Wall Street, to lose billions of dollars in a nanosecond on Wall Street. Its impact on war. Fighting in a place, cyberspace, that didn't exist a generation ago, cyber warfare. Its impacts on social relationships. I can become friends via Facebook with someone that I've never met before. I may not want, however, my niece to become friends with someone that she's never met before. I think the computer also illustrates the aspect that bureaucracies often have a really tough time keeping up with change. So, for example, I do consulting with the FBI. And one of the things that's striking is sort of to compare how their directors have dealt with change. The director of the FBI did not own a computer, did not have an email account as late as 2001. Think about that for a minute. And how do you keep up with the fact that cybersecurity is now a major, major issue? The final parallel that people make is both a positive and a darker one. A lot of the scientists, but particularly the ethicists, make the parallel to nuclear physics in the 1940s. The idea is that back in the 1940s, if you wanted to work on what was hot, you wanted to work on what was cutting edge, if you were a young graduate student or a professor, you were drawn towards nuclear physics. That was where things were happening in science. The same thing today. If you are a young engineer, if you're a young computer scientist, you are drawn towards robotics and artificial intelligence, almost like a moth to the flame. You can't help yourself. This is where it's at. But of course, the concern is that usability opens it up. The second is policy changes that the folks from North Dakota can particularly speak to well. Congress is debating right now, it's basically ordered the FAA to open up the national airspace to unmanned aerial systems around 2015. Now it's unclear whether that'll happen. Maybe it's 2017, maybe it's 2019, but the point is it's looming, and its impact on the industry will be a lot like what the internet did for computers, another boom outwards. I was meeting with an executive from a small tactical UAV maker, and they described how right now they have one client, one customer. It's a great customer to have. It's the U.S. Department of Defense. They're doing very well. But they said when the airspace opens up, our client space will open up. We'll add 21,000 new client organizations. They were pointing to the fact that there's 21,000 local law enforcement agencies in the U.S., some of which can afford expensive aviation departments flying helicopters, a lot of which can't. And both of them may look at utilizing these systems, like as we've seen test programs by the Miami-Dade Police Department, the Ogden, Utah Police Department, you name it. So it opens it up. The third is something we've seen in war before, and it's the crossover between the military experience and the civilian economy, going back and forth. And at the meetings yesterday with Recon, we were talking about that, how you have a system where in some cases it's National Guardsmen who utilize it as a SWAT team going out to Afghanistan and saying, why don't we have this? Or it's the opposite, someone using it in Afghanistan and Iraq and going back as a reservist to their local police department saying, why don't we have that? We're seeing that back and forth proving ground playing out. The final most important, though, is the cross between imagination, innovation, and profit seeking. That is a lot like what happened with computers. Once you prove one type of use somewhere, it opens up an entire new market for that. So the idea of using unmanned aerial systems to do surveillance from overhead, we've proven that it works for targeting insurgents. We're also therefore now going, hold it, that's very useful for things like border control, tracking drug smuggling, as I mentioned, local policing, to environmental monitoring, to tracking tuna for fishing fleets, to, in Australia, they're using them for hunting great white sharks. And the reason is actually because hunting great white sharks is actually incredibly boring. It sounds odd to say that, but basically you're watching empty ocean for long periods of time just waiting for that one fin to pop up. People, lifeguards, don't do it well. Robots do it really, really well. These are all profit centers. But out of this comes another ripple effect. If it's comparable to automobiles, computers, etc., there will be winners and there will be losers. And we can think about this on a national level where it has national security consequences. Besides the US, there's 44 other nations building, buying, and using military robotics right now. But also in terms of industry. This is the connection between manufacturing and innovation. What does it mean to be sending out more and more soldiers whose hardware more and more says made in China on the back of it, and whose software is increasingly written by someone sitting in India? Or we looked at those education statistics. Well, what does it mean for U.S. national security that the number of students with a degree in IT is actually slightly less than we produced as a nation in 1986, even though we have a greater population? But don't worry, it's not all bad news. We have had a 500% increase in the number of students who majored in leisure and fitness studies. This question of winners and losers, though, also goes down to the state and local level. That is, if this is comparable to, say, the horseless carriage industry around 1910, well, who's going to be Detroit and become an epicenter for the industry for the next century? And who's going to become cities like Kokomo, Indiana, or Syracuse, New York, which back then had just as big of a footprint in horseless carriages as Detroit did, but of course didn't get the fruits of that over the next century. There's a notion that I'm getting at here that in the world of globalization, distance doesn't matter anymore. But study after study shows that location is important for not only recognizing business opportunity, but also cultivating an environment that's dedicated to entrepreneurial activity and lowers the cost of innovation. The examples go back in history, all the way back to Florence under the Medici, to Paris in the 1920s, to Silicon Valley today. That is, the evidence shows that innovation and the resulting spoils tend to cluster in specific places at specific times. And the role of government is incredibly central in developing these clusters. That is, while entrepreneurship is a private sector activity, it's public policy that sets the stage for helping to create the environment and the incentives that allow innovation to thrive. For example, I'm originally from North Carolina, and every time the education rankings come out, I'd hate to see where we were on that, but every time those kind of rankings come out with graphs like that, we're really glad that South Carolina exists, because that means we've got someone that we're slightly ahead of. North Carolina, though, did something really smart. When our textile industry was going down, our state government fostered a new innovation cluster centered around Research Triangle Park that's now the home of more than 130 R&D facilities and helped North Carolina become one of the hubs of the biotech industry, which boomed to benefit the rest of the state. That is, we have, by one measure, no right to be the hub of biotech, and yet smart policy got us there. And it didn't happen overnight. It included steady and consistent state policy, investment tax credits, and quasi-governmental and sector-specific agencies. That is, for all our complaints today of big government supposedly doing nothing, it's actually helped spur a lot of great things, whether it's the Research Triangle or the internet or the highway system. Sometimes government is needed to spur innovation and growth clusters. Another challenge that's often faced by industry is that firms don't often know about opportunities or programs that are available. And so government, in partnership with the private side, can facilitate information sharing. And I think that's really what this conference is about, because there's two things that come out from that. One is helping to give the area a brand, an identity. And the second is creating a forum for discussions and a central information repository. That is, a good example of this outside the US is what's called Silicon Wadi in Israel. Israel actually has the largest number of startup companies in the world outside the United States, and actually has more companies listed on NASDAQ than all of Europe. And they're clustered around Tel Aviv, or what's called Silicon Wadi. And the reason for this is not just that they put more into research and development than comparable countries, but also they have a dedicated effort to bring people together. And it ranges from things like non-profit event series, like what they call Garage Geeks, which is basically a regular meeting symposium where they bring together engineers and influential venture capitalists, to large conferences like GeekCon, which brings together tech officers, investors, and the geeks, basically in a different kind of setting to explore what's possible that then generates more industry coming out of it. There's also another best practice that we've seen in spurring innovation, co-location. And by this I mean not just the lab. A great example of this is the Aalto University area in Finland. It's one of the top innovation clusters in the world. It's everything from Nokia came out of there to Rovia, the creator of Angry Birds, maybe even more valuable to economy now and probably harming the economy since we all play on it when we should be working. But basically the motto of this area is an interesting one. Where science, this is their motto, quote, where science and the arts meet technology and business. That is, they believe all four matter. And so they've created things, not just facilities for tech companies, but where all four can come together, like the Design Factory, which is a space for multidisciplinary innovation, or the Aalto Venture Garage, which is a place that has both startup entrepreneurs and startup artists. And the point is, this didn't happen on its own. It actually came out of public-private partnerships, including the investing of over 10 billion euro in transforming that area. And it was also tied tightly into their local education system, everything from elementary all the way up to the university level. Another key factor in innovation is openness to outsiders. That's true whether we try and figure out why is it that Austin thrives so much compared to the rest of Texas, to Singapore, which has been described as one of the top 3 innovation hubs in the world. Part of the reason is in Singapore, their R&D teams break down almost perfectly 50-50 between native Singaporeans and foreigners brought in. And the city has actually created scholarships, not just for locals, but to bring in top people from the outside. This idea of openness to outsiders is, again, not just something to think about on the local or state level, it's a national level issue. Canada sets aside 60% of their equivalent green cards for people that they believe will be an aid to their economy and their national security. 60%. Last year, this was about two and a half years ago. In South Africa, an automated anti-aircraft cannon had a software glitch. It's an interesting term, software glitch. That's the same thing that the FAA described happened to it a couple months ago, where there was a software glitch in one computer in Atlanta that grounded over 700 passenger jets. In this case, the gun had a software glitch during a training exercise. It was supposed to fire upwards into the sky. Instead, because of the glitch, it leveled itself and started firing in a circle. It killed 9 soldiers before it ran out of ammunition. Oops. And the point that I'm making here is not that these incidents happen, but rather, again, go back to the law. What would you do if you were the young officer, the young lawyer asked to investigate, asked to adjudicate, who do we hold responsible? How do we figure this out? The challenge for us is that our technology is moving at this incredible exponential pace, but our laws move at a linear, or even, we had a couple congressmen on there, I would say to them, a glacial pace. And the distance between them is growing wider and wider. For those of us who work in the realm of war, the challenge right now is the Geneva Conventions, which are the prevailing laws of war, are so old that if they were people, they would qualify for Medicare. It's very hard for them to keep up with technology like this. But similarly, there's another set of questions that come out of this. The innovation spread will allow a wider set of users who will then innovate for all sorts of purposes. Some of them will innovate for positive purposes. Like I mentioned, all of those different industrial uses of unmanned aerial systems. To a team at University of Pennsylvania that's using robots to do environmental monitoring in Antarctica. I mean, again, there's all sorts of different uses of these technologies. But of course, there's a flip side to this. What we're seeing is the warfare equivalent of what's happened in software, open sourcing. That is, not just the big boys can control what happens anymore. Not just the big boys in manufacturing, but also the big boys in war. That is, this technology is not like an aircraft carrier. It's not like an atomic bomb. You don't need a massive defense industrial structure to build it or to use it. Instead, we're seeing a flattening effect. So you saw that image of the Raven. It was the unmanned aerial system that you toss like a javelin and it flies away. It's one of the most widely used unmanned aerial systems by our military in Afghanistan today. The editor of Wired magazine, however, built his own version of a Raven for $1,000. And so this flattening effect means that we have to figure out who are those that we want to have this technology and who are those that we don't want to have this kind of technology. So, for example, environmental monitoring, great. Flip side, we've seen uses of similar technology by border militia, kind of in the law but not within the law, to darker uses. For example, the war between Israel and Hezbollah was a war between a state and a non-state actor. Hezbollah, a lot of people consider it a terrorist group. It flew unmanned aerial systems against Israel. So 4 weeks ago, we had an individual in Massachusetts who had planned to fly a drone into the Pentagon. He actually had the system. The problem for him wasn't getting a drone, it was getting the C4 explosives to pack into the drone. He made the mistake of asking an FBI informant for explosives. If he'd asked someone else, he would have pulled it off. Getting the robot was the easy part. Getting the bomb was the hard part. The point that we're seeing here is that individuals and small groups are getting incredible powers to both do fun, interesting, incredible things, but also maybe dark things. So as an illustration, during World War II, Hitler's Luftwaffe could not cross the Atlantic, did not have that reach. 2 years ago, a 77-year-old blind man built his own drone that flew itself across the Atlantic. Again, a hobby, but also a potential dark side. To the parallel of horseless carriages. Cars have been used for recreation, for transportation, for policing, but they've also not just been used for car bombs, they've been used by criminals. So for example, my nominee for the best example in the field of robotics this year was actually a team of thieves in Taiwan who used tiny robotic helicopters equipped with pinhole cameras to steal $4 million worth of jewelry. But again, I'm someone interested mostly in war, and I'm often asked, what's the thing that scares me the most? And the easy answer is the robot insects. Those are really, really spooky. But the real answer to me, my biggest concern as someone who works in war, is the impact that the technology is happening on our politics and we aren't talking about enough. That is, robotics are taking certain trends that are happening in our democracy right now and maybe taking them to their ending point. We don't have a draft anymore. We don't declare war anymore. Last time the Congress formally declared war was 1942 against Hungary, the last to join the Axis powers. We don't buy war bonds anymore. During World War II, Americans bought $183 billion worth of war bonds. Over the last 10 years, we've bought $0 worth of war bonds. And then finally now, we have a technology that allows us to carry out acts of war without having to think about some of the political consequences of sending someone into harm's way. And the condolence letter that isn't going to that father or mother, which is a positive for that father or mother, but may have a different effect on the senior policymaker and changes the way they look at what we would have used to call war. I don't think this is a political theory issue. I think we're actually seeing it in the war in Pakistan right now. I mean war in Pakistan. By the raw numbers, the U.S. has carried out 307 airstrikes into Pakistan over the last couple of years using unmanned aerial systems. That's 7 times the size of the number of targets that we hit in the opening round of the Kosovo War. But we don't call it the Pakistan War. Congress didn't have a vote on it, didn't even have a single hearing on it. The media doesn't report it the same way. Sometimes it makes the news, sometimes it doesn't. Yesterday in airstrike, that was it. Finally, it isn't even being carried out by the U.S. Air Force. The commander is not a 4-star general. The individuals making the rules of engagement decisions are not military lawyers. It's being carried out by a civilian intelligence agency, with all the individuals involved being civilians who are political appointees. Notice I didn't say it's a good operation or a bad operation. I'm just saying something that we used to call war, we don't call war anymore because of the technology that we're using. But this notion of the nation going to war changing is also changing for the individual going to war. For 5,000 years, the experience of going to war was pretty much the same. You went to a place of such danger, you might never see your family. You might never come home again. That's what it meant to go to war. Whether you were talking about the ancient Greeks going to war against Troy, or my grandfather going to war against the Japanese in the Pacific. That was a fundamental truth of war until today. This is what Predator Squadron Commander described to me of what it was like to fight insurgents in Iraq while never leaving Nevada. Quote, "You are going to war for 12 hours, shooting weapons at targets, directing kills on enemy combatants. And then you get in the car and you drive home. And within 20 minutes, you're sitting at the dinner table talking to your kids about their homework." End quote. Now the interesting thing is that while the nation may be thinking about wars as video games, the individuals involved are actually doing the opposite. That is, while the nation's not paying much attention, the individuals involved care deeply. These units, in fact, have higher levels of combat stress and fatigue than comparable units physically in Iraq and Afghanistan. And we've got to figure out, again, what are some of the challenges and ripple effects that come out of that. The final ripple effect that I would mention is demographics. Who can do what? And we're seeing that everything. I think we'll hear it later about fields of medicine to agriculture, but it's also playing out in war. And in fact, that's probably my favorite story in the book, is the story of a young man who was a high school dropout who wanted to make his dad proud of him again. So he volunteered to join the U.S. Army. The recruiting officer looked at his high school transcript and he said, "Son, what do you want to be?" He said, "I'd like to be a helicopter mechanic." He said, "I'm sorry, son, under Army rules, you're not qualified to be a helicopter mechanic. Would you like to be an unmanned aerial systems operator instead?" He turned out to be incredible at it. He turned out to be so good that after his first deployment, they brought him back. They promoted him to a specialist. Andrew, what does a specialist make about?
20 grand.
Around like 20 grand. This is not a great promotion. And then they made him an instructor in the pilot training academy. It's a great story from one perspective. Because of this technology, this young man found himself, made his dad proud of him again, serving his nation incredibly well. I told the story at the Air Force Association National Convention last year. They did not like the story. You have a teenage, high school dropout, enlisted man, not an officer, in the Army, worst of all, who's now not just a pilot instructor, but has taken out more enemy targets than every single F-22 fighter jet pilot put together. They look at him with the same mix of kind of dismay, but also a little bit of fear, as the knights looked at the peasants when the peasants got guns. Like, what are you going to do? Oh, hold it. What does this mean for me and my world? But robotics aren't just things that go around us and change who does what. They're also changing us, as you saw from those images there. One of the more powerful stories is the more than 400 American soldiers who've lost arms or legs due to IEDs, due to roadside bombs, and had them replaced with robotic prosthetics that are so good now that more than 400 troops have gone back to serve in their combat units with an artificial arm or leg. The test for the program is equivalent to completing the Ironman triathlon with one of these systems. It's an incredibly powerful story. But of course, we're humans. We don't stop at replacement. We work on enhancement, bigger, better, faster, stronger. So there's a lot of biomedical work going on here. Has anyone in here had laser eye surgery? Okay, let's compare what you got to what a British Special Operations, one of their SAS troopers, got in surgery last year. Did your laser eye surgery allow you to see 300 meters at night? That's the world we're entering into in terms of pushing new frontiers with our technology. So in closing, there's always two sides to a revolution. Moore's law is playing out, but Murphy's law isn't going away. We're getting science fiction-like capabilities, but that also means we have science fiction-like ripple effects playing out in our world and questions that we have to solve. And it sounds like, though, these are all future things to figure out. But notice how every single picture you saw, every single example I gave you, isn't from the future. It's from today. And so the point is, are we going to let the fact that robots look like science fiction, sound like science fiction, keep us in denial that they are technologic, economic, political, legal, and ethical reality? Thank you.